Good evening. Welcome to this evening's edition of Tiski Sal. My name's Ronan Bastani. Thanks for joining us again. Obviously, Michael normally hosts this show, but I've been in the chair both this evening and yesterday because we've gone to 5 nights a week for both this week and potentially next week, obviously depending on what happens. But we'll be going nightly between now and Thursday. Well, that's the plan anyway. Tonight, I've got the immense pleasure of being joined again by Ronan Burtenshaw. How you doing, Ronan?
Hi, Aaron. How's things?
Very good. Ronan, obviously, as some of you may recall, is the editor-in-chief, is that right, of Tribune magazine?
We just use editor, but yeah.
Yeah? Not editor-at-large?
No.
No? Editor-in-chief of Tribune magazine, which is something of an appendage of the Jacobin Empire in the US, I guess it's fair to say. Because Jacobin started in, 2011?
2010, 2011, yeah.
And you guys have been around for like a year.
Yeah, as a relaunch publication.
Yeah.
So obviously Tribune goes a lot further back. We may even talk about some of this, given the context of other publications that are in the minds of the left at the moment. So Tribune goes back to 1937 and the campaign around the Popular Front against fascism and the British kind of wing of that campaign. The desire to try to bring together various forces on the left towards a coherent anti-fascist narrative, which was not being served by many other media outlets at that time. That's where Tribune comes from. It then became the Bevanite publication through the Second World War, arguing for a class struggle perspective on the Second World War, and then for the reconstruction of Britain along socialist lines after 1945. So it has a great and rich history, but we launched it a year ago, it having fallen into very tough times. And
a state of disrepair, it's fair to say.
Yeah, and we are where we are now. We've had a year of this for better and worse. A lot of work, but we're doing all right.
So for most of tonight's show, because obviously I spoke with Ronan last week, we discussed the media. We're not going to be, for once, I won't be denigrating and moaning about the state of the mainstream media. I mean, I do that so often. I don't like doing it. In fact, that's why I started Novara Media, along with James Butler. But it's obviously something that has to be discussed in the context of the general election right now. We won't be doing that. We'll be talking more about new media. Mm-hmm. What's its impact been in the general election? Has the left deployed it in a better way compared to 2017? What can be learned going forward? We're not going to speak for that long. We're maybe going to speak for 30, 40 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. What I want to see is comments from you guys, feedback. Is it being effective? How are you consuming political media? How do your parents, your friends, your work colleagues consume political media, the news? Are you finding that social media is effective in changing people's minds on the doorstep when you're canvassing? These kinds of questions. We want to know what you think. But before we do any of that, Ronan has hinted at what we're going to talk about very briefly. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there was the New Statesman editorial yesterday. Have to be very clear about this. Great deal of respect for many journalists at the New Statesman, but the editorial is obviously a wholly different thing. What did you make of that editorial? As somebody who's editing a magazine, which is effectively, it's a competitor publication, what did you make of that editorial? And what does it say to you about the state of the politics currently behind the New Statesman as a magazine?
Well, look, I mean, one of the things that Jason Cowley said in response to the left-wing criticism of that editorial is that no one had taken it on from an intellectual standpoint or from the point of view of its arguments. I think it's worth doing, actually. In my view, it is the classic liberal editorial during an election cycle where there is real class struggle at play. I think it's well worth socialists getting into their minds the difference between liberalism and socialism. What liberalism is about is the mediation between capital and labour. So at times like the 1990s, the early 2000s, when there's generalized prosperity, when living standards are improving for a majority of people, and there's a buy-in, a political consensus about how things are going, it can do very well. You get these big dynasties built up, Blair, Clinton, Schroeder, and there is this kind of belief that develops amongst liberals, a kind of that, I think, of the King Canute kind of example, right, where you're standing there at the sea and watching the tides come in and out and thinking that you're somehow responsible for that. Of course, in the actual King Canute example, in the Henry of Huntington story, King Canute realizes that he doesn't control the tides, and that actually there is this greater power of God which is more powerful than any king. That is the realization that liberals never come to. They always believe that capitalism in this instance can simply be controlled, can be contained. I think of another very important article that's been written in the last few weeks by a prominent liberal in Martin Wolf in the Financial Times. Martin Wolf has been writing time and time again for weeks, for months, for years about the system being out of control, about capitalism needing to be reined in, the problems of inequality, the problems in the financial sector, all of these things. But the liberal position is always and will always be to believe, as the good bourgeois, that what you have to do is reform the system from above. And they always get petrified at the prospect that any of the kind of reforms that would be necessary to capitalism would be won through struggle from below and from workers. And so Martin Wolf, having said all of these things about the need to change the system, when he is presented with a Labour Party manifesto, writes a kind of vaguely hysterical piece about how it's going to destroy the economy of Britain. Despite the fact the Labour manifesto was no more radical and would have no more public spending and would have no more nationalisation than is common in many parts of Europe and particularly in the Nordic countries. And that is because, as that kind of Elizabeth Warren t-shirt that was going around today made clear, is that capitalism without rules is theft. You know, these people really do believe that the fundamental question is reining capitalism in, and so they're left standing there on that beach when the waves eventually wash over them, and totally incapable of responding to it. That is what happened to Blair, it's what happened to Clinton, it's what happened to Schroeder, it's what happened to the entire centre-left in the period of 2008, when the kind of financialised economy that they sat on top of in order to redistribute fell apart around them. And that is the characteristic, the political tradition that is represented by New Statesman's leader in this instance. It talks about the need for reform. It talks about some of the problems that exist within the British economy. It even mentions the word capitalism, but presented with a movement that could actually affect the kind of changes needed to prevent the descent into hardline right-wing politics, it shies away from it. And it shies away from it not just because of XY scandal, because of Brexit, because of the anti-Semitism case. It shies away from it fundamentally because the New Statesman, from the beginning of the Corbyn project, has never been comfortable with it, on the basis that the Corbyn project is attempting to reinvigorate class struggle. It's attempting to reinvigorate the idea of a society that is not going to have good liberal reformers sitting on top dictating this or that change, but where the power of concentrated wealth is going to be taken on, is going to be challenged, and through that battle, society will be reshaped and a better economy will be produced. So I think people need to get into their minds what that kind of political position is, and therefore what you can expect from those kind of publications. You can expect them to bring in some good left-wing writers, and as we've just said, there are some good writers at the publication. You can expect them to be favourable to some of the things we said. But on the fundamental question of what our politics is about, that fight, they're never going to be with us. And so I don't think it's surprising.
Do you think that left-wing writers should write for them? Now, obviously, people have to pay bills; they have to make ends meet. Mm-hmm. But also, it seems to me, I know some great people that write for them, but it does seem to me that they're using that left-wing cachet credibility. Look, the Tories tweeted that. Mm-hmm. The Daily Mail wrote about it. So it's almost you know. I mean, I think I've written something for the New Statesman before. Mm-hmm. You know, that they've spoken very favourably about Novara Media. Mm-hmm. Well, my worry is that the left continues to furnish them with that credibility, which is then used against us. Because until the ownership of it changes, until the editorial policy of it changes, until it's no longer a liberal publication, which, as you've said, is perfectly not coherent, but it's a historic intellectual tradition in this country. Until that changes, then they're never really going to fall on the right side of this, are they, politically?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting because, again, this gives lie to many of the conceits of liberalism, right? That really the media environment is about the exchange of ideas. It's not. There is a means of production of ideas and the means of distribution of ideas in a very clearly Marxist sense. People cannot just go out there very easily, set up their own publication without funding. They cannot just have their ideas proliferated. And so if you're a left-wing writer, what choices do you really have? And so I would never criticize anyone. I mean, I take a very broad perspective on this. I would say the sun is out and so forth, and the really kind of hardline right-wing ones, okay, fair enough. But I also, as I've said before, I was a youth rep for the NUJ. I get it. People go and they write for places because they need to make a living. Yeah. And the truth is, in this country, there is no large socialist publication that is producing enough readership to give people a living, and so people have to. But there's a few things that are important when you're considering that question, right? Because I thought one of the really interesting points of Cowley's editorial or leader was when he opens up and he talks about the problem of our hyper-partisan media. Because that told me so much about where the New Statesman sits and why it was a quintessentially liberal position. If you can't look at the British media landscape in any objective sense today and say, oh, it's hyper-partisan. It's slanted one direction. We talked about this the last time. 60% of the print media owned by Murdoch's News UK and the Daily Mail Group. The vast array of right-wing propaganda coming out of the print media, resulting in huge bias against Labour, then being reflected and pushed through the public service broadcasters because they're allowing the news media to set the agenda. When you look at that and you don't see a huge imbalance and a role for yourself to be on the left fighting back against it, and instead you look at that and you see something that's hyper-partisan that you must stand above in this kind of, or I consider it to be pretty arrogant, but this kind of the position of the critic, not the position of the partisan, then I think you've got a serious problem. I think it tells you a lot about why right-wing interests continue to defeat left-wing interests, why the rich continue to be able to walk all over the poor in this country, is because so many people who are in positions and have huge pedestals like the New Statesman, who could be using it to be partisans in a battle for a better society, are instead standing aloof from it as critics.
Yeah, there was one part of the article which made me think. It said, and I quote, I mean, maybe we can pull this up. I haven't dropped it in on Fox. Doesn't really matter. As a publication that is beholden to no party or faction, that defends the intellectual traditions of scepticism, independence of thought, spirit of criticism, and a willingness to debate, we believe that voters deserve better. And none of those things are objectives. None of those things are goals. They're all means. I like scepticism. I agree with independence of thought. But what do you want? Obviously in a general election, political parties are offering the electorate different things. Those are means to ends rather than ends in themselves. It carries on by saying, there are many fine parliamentarians from all parties, Luciana Berger, Joanna Cherry, Jess Phillips, Rosie Duffield, Jim McMahon, Dan Jarvis, Sarah Wollaston, Rachel Reeves, to name but a few, whose fortitude and resilience are admirable. And you're saying, we're not really aligned to a faction. And then you basically list a bunch of kind of centrist, neoliberal technocrats, which that's fine. But that is, if we had PR in this country, proportional representation, and there was a centrist liberal party, that would be its composition. Yeah. So it seems strange to me to sort of disavow, we're not ideological and we'd have no faction, and then literally, name by name, list a faction of people.
I mean, the other thing is, I find that interesting because in one sense, I have great respect for that idea of the critic, which I was giving out about a second ago, right? And it's this idea: you get these people who, through history, as journalists, have seen it as their responsibility to take their audience and challenge their prejudices rather than reaffirm them. Right, this is the role of the critic, and this is the idea I think that the New Statesman's editorial team has about its role in society. But let's be totally 100% frank about this. Going and writing to a load of liberal middle-class people about why you can't back Corbyn because of Brexit and anti-Semitism is not challenging people's prejudices. There's a great line that when I think of critics for all of his flaws, the journalist Alexander Cockburn had about the New York Times firing volley after volley of cliche into the densely packed prejudices of its readership. Well, I mean, that's what this is. That's what this is. If you go and you look at the enormous challenges facing society today, the rising far right, a decade-long period of stagnation of capitalism, climate change, all the rest, and you pick out the anti-Semitism controversy and Brexit as reasons why you're refusing to be on the pitch in an election of this level of importance, you're not challenging a single prejudice.
I saw quite it was a joke, chuckle. It was a photo of a woman sort of helping a homeless person on the street, and the caption was, "Sorry, I'd love to help, but I need a leader who's coming out for Remain along with their party. You just think, this is basically it. You know, more than 700 people dying on the streets. Somebody died, I believe, in Liverpool or near Merseyside yesterday. And they're quite proudly sort of just owning that. Before we move on, we spoke briefly about Tribune magazine. I mean, you are something of a rival to them, I guess. Where would you like to see Tribune in 2-3 years?
When we say we're a rival, I mean, we're a fraction of the size and influence of a New Statesman, so we're not...
Are you a fraction of the size?
Yeah, well, because...
I mean, their print circulation isn't that big.
No, but then there's a couple of things to say there, right? So the New Statesman's print circulation might not be massively large on ours, so we've got about 10,000 subscribers now, and their print circulation, I think, is around 30,000, but they're out much more regularly than us. They've got much more online subscribers, and also their online traffic is much, much bigger. So
even with the paywall?
Yeah, you got to be realistic about that. There's no question that it is. So, you know, and it is in a large part because of resources. Now, it's not to say that they don't do a lot of things better than we do. I'm sure that they do. But it's the fact that when you've got the resources to hire a massive staff, I mean, we have one full-time member of staff, you know, it's just not comparable to...
You've only been around a year.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, how many full-time staff does Jacobin have, for instance, in the US?
That is a good question now. I think Jacobin's total staff, full-time and part-time, is up to 45, 50.
Right. Well, that's big.
Yeah, it is. It's gotten big now. How much of that is all with the mothership and how much is with, because there's various Jacobin projects in terms of Jacobin Brazil, Jacobin Germany and so on, Jacobin Italia. So there's a few different parts of that. But yeah, it has. But, you know, we're talking about Jacobin starting in 2010, 2011, and we're now in 2019, 2020. So it takes a long time to build up to even the position that Jacobin was in. And it is, you know, something that people have to get their head around. If you want to have an alternative, if you want socialists not to be reliant for the communication of their political message on hostile media outlets, liberal media outlets, or, you know, even worse, right-wing media outlets, we've got to build our own. We've got to support our own. People have got to be able to subscribe to things, contribute to Novara, because at the moment there is this media ecosystem which has so few left-wing outlets and so much concentrated power on the right and wealth on the right that we're fighting a very uphill battle. And it does not. This is, again, coming back. I know people are going to think I spend all my time going off at liberals. Sometimes I do. But you know, this is one of the big conceits that of that like position of the critic, right, the liberal critic, that we're in this exchange of ideas. That's what the media is about. No, it's not. It's just not. It's about the projection of ideas by people with an awful lot of power and wealth. That's what the big media institutions are about. They're not democratic. They're owned in a massively concentrated way by billionaires who subject themselves to no accountability, no scrutiny. They're able, because of this, to pay people to produce a huge amount of content that affects the whole circulation of information in our society. And looking at that and thinking we're engaged in the free exchange of ideas is mad. I mean...
Can I, because we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail with regards to digital stuff. I just wanted to say, just building on that, a great example, probably some of you have seen this video with Andrew Neil today. He's basically, it seems to me an admission that we're not going to be able to get the interview with Boris Johnson. These are the questions I would have asked, which in a way isn't good, because obviously if Boris Johnson does choose to do the interview, he's now fully prepared and he has an advantage that other people didn't have. But Boris Johnson, former editor of The Spectator, Andrew Neil, after 2004, chairman of The Spectator, Dominic Cummings' wife is a commissioning editor at The Spectator, Michael Gove, a former leader writer at The Times, Andrew Neil, a former editor at The Sunday Times. The Sunday Times, owned by Rupert Murdoch. The Spectator, owned by the Barclay brothers. And so it's not just about a concentration of wealth, which it is, but I think if people understood the extent to which it's a concentration of human beings, like a lot of these people literally live on the same street. You know, there were top people at the BBC living next door to Boris Johnson, who lived near Sarah Sands, who used to edit the Evening Standard. Now she's editor at the Today programme on BBC. You know, it's just a huge... And they all live in London. They all know each other. They all went to the same universities. And then you alloy that with the resources point. And I think that, you know, the fact that Britain is such a... The concentration of wealth is always a big thing. But when you add to that the predominance of London, metropolitan bias in Britain, the predominance of two universities in the university system, the private school system. I mean, it's horrific. And for 50, 60 years, we mitigated it through Labour-based socialism.
Exactly, yes.
But that's now kind of, well, it's hopefully coming back.
It's on the wane.
It's certainly much weaker than it was, before we were born, for instance.
I agree. And that produces a lot of things. The term I think to use there is the habitus, the kind of accumulation of the cultural norms within that kind of small space. And people are going to the same schools and they're coming from the same area and they're going to the same dinner parties and they're living next door to people and so forth. Well, then the kind of conversations that they're having day in and day out are going to shape a very particular worldview. And there may be spectrums of that worldview, but it's not going to be massively departing from the establishment political view, right? Because you're not going to have your views challenged that often in that space, and particularly not views challenged in such a way that it might inconvenience, you, or that it might cost you some amount of your salary or whatever else. So, I can understand that, say, on Brexit, I'm quite sure that there would be very, very significant arguments on those streets that you've just mentioned between people and their lines, their views on these things. And on social questions, there will be disagreements. But one of the fundamental differences, I think, between us as socialists and that kind of sphere is the question of what does Brexit represent? Is Brexit itself the crisis, or is Brexit a symptom of a crisis, right? So again, to harp back on the New Statesman leader, the key thing comes up there that Corbyn didn't take a position on Brexit. His refusal to take a position on Brexit is the reason why he's disqualified as a Prime Minister. Whereas it's perfectly acceptable for a New Statesman to refuse to take a position on the proliferation of food banks, people dying because of the Fit for Work programme, massive homelessness, 130,000 homeless kids at Christmas. They're perfectly permitted to refuse to take a stance on those things politically. But not taking a stance on Brexit is unacceptable and disqualifying. And it raises the question, in what kind of world is the refusal to take a stance on Brexit so much more significant than a refusal to take a stance on those things? And the answer is in a post-material world, in a world where you don't really have to care about material things. You're doing all right. The system is working for you. And in this society today, that is a small world. And it's a world that's getting smaller. And that's one of the reasons why, when I speak to journalist friends and colleagues of mine, they're outraged that people go on and criticize the media. And I say to them, if you're living in that world and it is shrinking and it is getting smaller, you may expect the people outside of it, not up the hill, to be critical and to be increasingly angry at the worldview that you're reflecting that doesn't reflect their opinion. It is crazy. It is a really bizarre situation to be in a country where the leader of the main opposition party has not one media organisation of any size that backs him and backs his programme.
How does that change?
That's a long...
Quick answer.
We have to build our own institutions.
So you don't think that The Guardian or the Daily Mirror could ever be, or the New Statesman for that matter, could ever be... Do you think until you change the ownership of these publications, they can't really be real allies for the left?
I think it's difficult. Again, what I'm not saying here is that people shouldn't write for them. And I'm not saying either that people shouldn't be in there and having a battle and trying... Look, part of the socialist project has got to be to transform institutions that are not at all in our favour, right? Institutions that were built partly to repress working class interests and so on. This is what we're engaged in. We have to transform institutions as well as building new ones. But fundamentally, even from the question of how do you shift the coverage of the likes of The Guardian and New Statesman and so on, well, in all probability, the most effective way of shifting that coverage will be showing that people are migrating from reading their stuff to reading left-wing publications.
Is even that true? Because I was thinking about the New Statesman thing, and it's obviously not... I don't think it's a political decision they've made, personally. It's definitely not a business decision.
I think it's... You see, the question comes down, right, to this... And I've been...
Well, do you think they're out... So do you think... they've just got Jeremy Cliff, who I actually think is a perfectly enjoyable person to read, former Economist guy, and that's clearly showing the kind of political trajectory they want to go down.
Agreed, yeah.
Rather than... they were picking some interesting left-wing people that they're sort of moving away from that now, going to this kind of centre ground sort of debate, moderately social democratic on economics, but not really. Sort of slightly to the left, maybe of Blair, and then sort of centrist moderates on social issues. But it seems to me, if you look at young people, if you look at millennials, the exact audience that Jacobin gets in the United States, or the exact kind of content that's proving very successful, Teen Vogue, right? Or Lad Bible, or Joe, they're producing content to the left of the New Statesman.
Yep.
And so it shows you there's a huge market for these guys. So just purely from a business perspective, why don't you think they're catering for that? Or you think they do? They do?
No,
it is a business decision?
I think it's a business decision but I think their business model is different. That would be my analysis. And now this is one of those points where I step off the kind of, into speculation. So people have to accept that. I don't know what's going on inside the New Statesman in terms of their business decisions. But here's my guess. My guess is that they figure that the audience that was going to pick up political magazines, general political magazines, right, are people who are more middle-aged, who they're going to pick up New Statesman because they've got some liberal leanings, but they're politicos. They're interested in like politics for politics. They're interested in the show of it, the personalities, the characters, at least as much as they're interested in any of the kind of substantive questions of policy and so forth. And they're going to be, because we have to be realistic, within the Corbyn project, there is a serious age divide. Right, there is the kind of younger Corbynites, and it almost plays out. I don't want to like get too Freudian about all this, but it plays out as a kind of Oedipal thing where you've got younger left-wing Corbynites and their parents that are giving out about the centrist dads. I remember when that phrase was coined, I thought to myself, yeah, oh God, this is, I understand what people are saying with it, but it's problematic what it reflects, which is that you've got this kind of big generation in the middle of politics who are disproportionately hostile towards the left because they grew up and their political worldview was shaped by the 1990s and 2000s that I described, right? Blair and Clinton and Schroeder, and they are desperate to get back to the status quo ante, to the world just before 2008, or even, to the London Olympics and all of that kind of nostalgia. They're animated by nostalgia just as much as the right is. And I think that a magazine that's looking to sell off the shelf today, right, and is looking to try to make money that way, is going to be aiming at that so-called centrist dad market.
Okay. I understand that impulse, although that's a very, very, very saturated market. Right, from GQ and Arena all the way through to the New European. It's basically the entire of print media is catering to that demographic 45-year-old centrist, moderately affluent man. But surely there's a space. And I'm talking about this to Jim. I shouldn't say this probably on the record. I was talking to Jim Watson about this a couple of years ago when he was at BuzzFeed, and he said, you know what? I think the gap that's really obvious in British media right now is millennial left-wing lifestyle / politics / culture website, very heavy on a social media halo, clippable videos going to Instagram and Snapchat. And it seems to me so common sense. And you see glimpses of it with Joe or with Lad Bible. But people like the New Statesman, I think they've got 2,000 followers on Instagram. Now, I know what you mean, but it just does seem to me that there's a whole business opportunity that isn't even being engaged with, but we'll leave it at that. I do think what you're saying makes perfect sense. We've got 1,400 people watching this, but we've only got 238 thumbs up. I want you to hit the thumbs up. If you like what Ronan's saying, I want you to maybe comment. Let's get the algorithm going, algorithmic capitalism being what it is. And also, actually, I want to say I'm a big fan of Tribune. The last issue you published was excellent. Had something from a Sheffield councillor, had something from a councillor, I believe, in Hull, talking about racist abuse against taxi drivers. Yep. You had a brilliant piece about soldiers in North Africa in World War II, prefiguring the Parliament of 1945 and the Labour government of Clement Attlee. So if you're not familiar with Tribune, go check out the website. It's quite cheap to subscribe. I'm not being paid to say this, believe it or not. I think it's probably so cheap to subscribe that you probably need to rethink it at some point, but that's a whole different conversation. It's a really good publication. Can't recommend it enough. What we're going to do now is really just talk about the social media stuff, and this is where I want to bring you guys in a bit more. So, social media. Is it working? Has it been effective in circumnavigating the mainstream media in this election campaign over the last 6 weeks?
I think it's very hard for us to circumvent. Okay, so, look, this has been a challenge from the beginning of the kind of Corbyn project, and I don't think it has answered it. How do you go through the existing institutions, or do you go around them? And I think we've ended up kind of oscillating between those two positions in an unconvincing way. It's hard to go around when we think of, say, for instance, Donald Trump's campaign, right? And people making the points that, well, wasn't he able to go around the kind of biggest media institutions in the US? Well, yes, to a certain degree, but he was able to do it with a huge amount of money poured into online advertising, building up like profiles of these people. It's like the idea that, when the right does this, say like the Tea Party and whatever, that it's some kind of grassroots phenomenon. It's not. These are like extremely well-funded operations that have a strategy of getting around the mainstream media that works in a large part because of their funding. So to be a vulgar materialist about it, I think it's very hard unless we, discover some Bernie bros in Silicon Valley who are prepared to bankroll us to do it. I think it's very hard to use social media alone. The other thing which we have to acknowledge here is social media is not like some kind of free arena. You've got major corporate interests who are dictating the circulation of information there too.
But that's a separate thing, isn't it?
It is, but then you get the question. So, like,
I'm not saying it's a revolutionary way of doing political communications, but the question is, does it allow, even if it is subject to the logic of capitalism, etc., does it allow us right now to circumvent?
We can do a certain amount
a different kind of elite sort of media.
We can do a certain amount of it. I think you guys do it well, where you try to create. You're aiming at like. Going around the media with the stories that they don't tell. So you're going directly to the. I saw Ash had a piece there on talking to some of the homeless about the election, right? People. I think she was with the Labour campaign against homelessness. And if you're going and you're doing stories like that and they're compelling, then yes, you can circumvent them because you can create viral content that people share, and there's a worthwhile. We don't have an alternative right now to doing that, and I think it's well worth trying to do. And I think a lot of people do it better than us. For Tribunes, like in terms of what Tribune does, we're obviously not like the kings of viral content. It's not what we do well. And one of the reasons why is that I do think you have to be careful that there's two projects here. Obviously, there's the project of getting our message out to society, but there's also the question of developing how people see the world, think about the world, and doing the job of political education. And they're kind of different because we found ourselves, even in the last while, bending the stick very far towards, talking more and more and more about Labour's policies, all of which is good, with the hope, by the way, that what ends up happening is people read the pieces, go out on the doorstep, argue for Labour's policies at the door, and don't get drawn into things like the real fear that I have with this campaign, a kind of anti-Borisism, that what we're all talking about is how this guy is terrible and the nasty things that he said and so on, that instead what you get is people talking about the policy, but you're not going to get viral content off doing that. So
what you're saying is you think print still matters, which is a question I probably should have already asked, because obviously
I'll go into that.
Yeah, one sec. So Tribune obviously started in a context of, apparently print no longer is relevant, makes money, not economical, etc. That isn't true, because obviously there are very successful print publications started in recent years, like Monocle magazine, for instance, The Economist, Private Eye, all doing very well. But what you're saying is actually the intention here isn't to get the most eyeballs, isn't to get the most attention, but it is to be part of a broader movement where people can engage in a process of political education. You think print is good for that still in a way that it probably always has been?
Yeah. I mean, my view is that this is going to be a long struggle. That we're just coming back. I think of this as the tide went so far out in 1990 for the left. Obviously, there was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the communist states and so forth. But actually, the one that's not discussed enough is there was this historic defeat of the Social Democrats, who all basically became social liberals, gave up the idea of fundamentally reforming the economy, and started just thinking about things in terms of getting a bit more growth to redistribute, and ended up then producing a huge problem for the centre left. And the tide went so far out for people who are critical of capitalism in 1990. This is just like it coming back in. and it kind of picked up whatever was on the beach when it came back in. So you got like people like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, who were on the fringes for a very long time, taking principled oppositionalist positions in defense of socialist values, but had almost no hearing, and they get swept into leadership. All of these young people, people of my generation and generation younger, who are getting brought into politics, but who don't really have a great amount of political experience. Even like when you think of, say, our generation, even there were battles in the student movement and so forth. And in Ireland, obviously, there was the huge stuff around the austerity, the troika, the water movement. But actually, in the last number of years, there hasn't been any like big social movement struggles on those kind of scales that's going to like bring people forward and develop their ideas. And so what we've got now is a kind of hodgepodge project.
That's not true in the US, though, is it? You've got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, probably the world's most high-profile millennial politician.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a big mass movement. You've got the DSA. In some ways, it's more advanced.
The DSA is about 50,000 members in a country of 330 million.
Sure, but I mean, its membership only a few years ago was
nothing.
10% of that.
Look, this is what I mean. We're coming, but the tide is only coming back in. This is going to be a long battle. Right? Capitalism has not produced a new model of popular prosperity. It's not managed to build a consensus about it to a majority of society. It's not improving people's living standards. It's concentrating wealth and power in a very small number of people. And it's going to have systemic challenges going forward. I mean, what I encourage people always to think of in this case, when they think, it's possible the system just rights itself again. Do we really believe we're going to go through the next decade, the 2020s, without a financial crash? Okay, or some degree of economic, serious recession, even if it's not a crash, right? I mean, most solid left-wing economists would say that it's quite unlikely that happens. And what happens when another big economic disjuncture hits this political arena with the rising far right, with huge amount of class frustration and whatever? I mean, we're only at the beginning of what is going to be a long reorientation of politics and economics. And what's needed, in our view anyway, is that
Tribune,
yeah. Is that you develop a layer of people with strong socialist arguments that can be communicated out to society. That's not just, because this project often ends up and has ended up as like Corbynism and about the man Corbyn. Perfectly decent man, so forth, right? Very important that he's risen to the position he has. But like Tribune is not a Corbynite publication; it's a socialist publication, and the idea is that we have to make the case for fundamental systemic change. We're going to have to do it on a sustained basis, and we're going to have to do it from a position of people understanding what we're arguing for and having really good kind of historical grounding in where the system has come from and where our movement has come from, understanding the socialist tradition, having a really good understanding of economics, right? Socialist economics, and what alternatives we propose and why, what capitalism is, so that it's not just seen as, business or someone making a bit of money here and there, but that it's seen as a system, and you understand, well, what's the role of labour within that, and how do working people, fight back against it and fundamentally move beyond it. That is the idea behind Tribune. And I don't think, certainly at this period, I don't expect we're going to be getting wonderfully viral content, but if we managed in a couple of years to have our subscriber base being people who are very strong about in their views of how society was going to be changed, and they were active locally, they were in the party, they were in their unions, they were in movements, they had clear socialist perspective, and we had 10,000, we had 15,000, we had 20,000. That'd be great. That'd be a very, very good start, because we need that kind of force in society to push through the changes we want.
I'm going to pull up some statistics from this article that was in The Guardian. Maybe you can just bring up the screen grab it. The link is there on the document, Fox. So this is from Ofcom. Some bits in The Guardian in a second. So this is from Ofcom. From 2019. TV is still the most popular way for people to access news. That's fallen from 75% to 75% of adults. Social media has gone from 49%. What was really interesting, though, about this was the sort of prominence still of the BBC. BBC One remains the most popular news source, despite a fall in use. The use of BBC News Channel has fallen. after BBC One and ITV was Facebook, which I thought was really fascinating. And I mean, I've always viewed that the channels that matter are social media, Facebook in this country, the print media, Facebook, and then the BBC. And then this was what came up in the Guardian. Now we can pull this up, Fox, if you can. This is a really great piece, how smartphones turned election news into chaos. And there was a quote from this. Dionio, who's one of the researchers, said he had noticed people struggle to remember individual stories, adding news doesn't stick as well. There's a new drama every day and cliffhangers on a daily basis. A lot of the respondents didn't have a good memory of what happened a week ago. And so I suppose the question I would ask you is, how do you do politics in that kind of context where people, and the same article talks about, for instance, people will actually only click about a third of the articles of which they've seen the headlines. So that basically, again, just, the sub-editor or whoever's chosen to write the headline, massively important. People are sharing articles without reading them. I mean, I've done that before. I don't do it, it's not a habit of mine. There was one woman, it was a case study in that article of how she was on the right. She would read an article from top to bottom, which she disagreed with, so that she would be well informed, but then intentionally sharing something to wind up her left-wing friends, which she actually didn't even agree with. So how do you do political media in that environment of a disintegration of a capacity to concentrate, a disintegration of shared rules and norms, as well as all the stuff about oligarch-owned media, the billionaire class with their newspapers and so on?
It's funny though, right? I mean, when we describe that, exactly what you've just described happening in media is happening in politics and it's happening in the economy as well, right? That these things are all linked. And there is a kind of, in my view anyway, a consistent approach to it, which looks a lot more like, say, what Bernie Sanders does in the United States in terms of political communication, which is people have got to be clear and consistent. You have a perspective that you are putting forward that is very clear, that you're making time and time again, that you're talking about the kind of stories. So say, for instance, wealth inequality, you're talking about the problems of poverty and social injustices. You're talking about why, though, fundamentally, that they're coming around. So you're talking about the fact that society is not fundamentally a question of competing ideas. It's a question of competing interests. And that at the moment, the people who are able to pursue their interests because of their power are the very richest, because they're able to pursue their interests through the political system. They're able to pursue their interests through the media. This is why the media is owned by a billionaire class. They're not doing it just out of some idle fancy that they, some of them I'm sure are quite vain people, but they're not doing it for that reason. Like a lot of them, even these people, when you think about it, are not seeking the political front lines for their own opinions. They're doing it because if you own the media outlet and you kind of set the terrain on which it operates, well then you can dictate the broad framework and terms under which people are understanding what it's writing. And what I mean by that is this, that you say, right, people don't remember individual stories.
Well, I'm not saying that's what the data seems to indicate.
Sure, right. Yeah. But they remember the tenor.
Precisely.
They remember, so
the affect.
Yes, it's people are no longer hearing the individual instruments, but they're hearing the orchestra. And they know kind of which way it's playing, right? That's what's going on. So if you're able then to influence a huge range of media outlets by owning them, and they all have a pretty similar kind of line on things, and you're carpet bombing people effectively with a whole series of different stories that all lean one way. Corbyn is this. Corbyn, is not to be trusted, economically
Brexit,
irresponsible.
Anti-Semitism, increase your taxes.
Yes, and by the way, it's happened with the Liberal press as well, that Brexit is something, there was very little attempt actually, strikingly so, to kind of explain and pull apart the reason why Brexit happened. It was mostly the question of saying there are these Brexiteers who are all, from a different era and they want to drag Britain back and they're this, rather than, what a critical media would do, which is look into in a serious way the kind of factors underlying it and start asking the question of why Brexit is so similar to phenomena like Trump in the United States and like the rise of far right in France. People would be asking the question, right, why all these phenomena are happening and looking at global patterns. actually what happens, and this is why it's so important that we see the media this way, as a way of pushing perspectives on the world rather than critically assessing it. It is people are pushing a narrative around Brexit that benefits certain fractions of the ruling elite. So in terms of the Brexit stuff, that narrative was pushed forward in order to give power to basically liberal business interests who were very concerned that they'd lost the Labour Party to the left, that the Tory party was moving to the right, and they were going to be left without a political vehicle through which to exercise their preferred vision of the economy, which is one that has is pro-globalization, pro-free trade, the kind of stuff the Economist argues for.
Well, The Economist today has come out with its endorsement for the Lib Dems,
Exactly.
which in a way is interesting because it speaks to the fact that those precise same interests actually don't really have that much influence anymore over concrete political outcomes in the way they would have 10 years ago. So you guys have a print magazine in this context where we agree with the data that people's concentration is disintegrating. I suppose there's two responses to that. Either you say those are the new rules of the game, which is kind of what Novara does a little bit. I mean, not all the time. This is a long-form conversation, but a lot of our content is 30 seconds on Twitter. These are the new rules of the game. Let's play by those rules and let's try and take it in a socialist direction. Or do you think the answer is no, we need to actually go back to older forms, genres of journalism, long-form, print, listening to the orchestra, but also the instrument, rather than just the orchestra. So is it a balance of both, or actually do you think we need to make a bit of a bid, a bit of a play for a different kind of media to 30-second Facebook clips that go viral?
I think it's interesting, right? Because obviously there's a lot of shared perspective between the two projects in Novara and Tribune. But then there's differences, and significant ones, right? Your audience is significantly bigger, and I would say in this election you'll have a much greater impact. And one of those reasons is because the difference between our kind of stuck in the mud perspective on some of these things, that's how it would be criticised, I'm sure. And the view, not only in terms of politics, where like I would think of us as like the new old left, emphasising the party, the state, class, and questions of capitalism in a way that is maybe more reminiscent of previous generations, and Novara coming from like the best of the new left perspectives and traditions, right? And that is replicated then also in terms of how you communicate the message. Some of this is like following on from what was inevitable. Like I was never going to be the kind of person who was going to be able to produce young and trendy content. It's just
Tribune's quite trendy though.
In a very particular way. I'll come to that in a second. It's never something I was good at, and I say that like for not as I say, it's critical too in terms of. I remember when I was involved in youth organising and trade unions, that it was also something I struggled with at a time when I really would have benefited from it, and I think unions would benefit from being able to speak more clearly in the terms and through the medium. The media that young people use, but it was never something that I was particularly good at. But I also think that there's something behind that, which is that there is a need, as much as you lean into the moment. Like my analysis of why young people are coming to the left is not that they're coming to the left because we're culturally cooler in the main. Young people are coming to the left for boring, old, bog standard materialist reasons. Their rent is too high. Their wages are crap. Their prospects of being able to live a decent life going forward are diminishing year on year. The public services they'd be relying on. Young people are coming to the left for those reasons.
Or the ones that are coming for the wrong reasons don't stick around very long, right? I mean,
I would agree with that.
People that say, oh, well, if Corbyn, loses on Thursday, the project's over, end of you lot. I'm like, if only. I've lived in 15 places in 15 years. Tens of thousands of pounds of student debt, etc. That's not that. I mean, sadly, that isn't going away. Whatever happens on Thursday, well, part of it would if Jeremy Corbyn's the Prime Minister, but yeah, it's bigger than that. But there is a part of having to be cool, isn't there? Otherwise,
there is.
If there wasn't, then obviously all the old left publications, the Communist Party of Great Britain, etc., they would have 30,000 members.
I agree.
The DSA does, and they don't because it's a bit cooler, as well as having good politics.
And it's always a tension between the kind of the perspectives we're representing here. How much do you lean into the moment of history and say that society has changed fundamentally, and some of the publications that I learned from, I think of the mass publications of the early 20th century, right? things like the Irish Worker and the Workers' Republic, obviously, Connolly and Larkin's papers I know very well, right? The history of them I would have studied, and how they were able to get big audiences and the kind of work that they did to generate those and so on. But we have to accept that like those days are gone, and the time has moved on from it being able to have, you know, kind of one strong shop steward in a workplace who hands this out, and then all of a sudden over a few years you get like a very strong readership of this left-wing labour oriented newspaper. The ways of communication have changed. The question is always, how much are you leaning into those changes and how much are you pushing back against them? And my worry is that, you know, if you don't do what we're trying to do in terms of the political communication, at least in the kind of strong socialist stuff, that if, say for instance, we were defeated on Thursday and we get a new Labour Party afterwards that is much more middle of the road economically, but tries to appeal to young people mostly through cultural appeals, how much have we given people the sense of saying, you know, that is not what our politics is?
Do you think that's, I mean, we're sort of moving away now from journalism to politics, but I suppose we can talk about it quickly. I don't even think that's plausible.
We'll see.
If I'm honest.
We'll see.
A worse instinct for me would be a kind of the response to Berlusconi in the 90s, which failed, or the response to Trump, you know, impeach him. That could be a really powerful, popular response, and I think it's bad politically. But I think the response of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister, all of a sudden the Labour Party's like, we're going to go back to like Yvette Cooper. I'm
telling you, the worry that I have is that you end up with anti-Boris politics, so kind of like anti-Trump politics in the US. Well, Bernie has managed to push through, obviously, despite it, because he has a movement behind him and so on. But the truth is, if you get relentless day in, day out controversies about what Boris did in his personal life, some stupid joke that he made, and this kind of fascination with Boris the personality, then politics could, the coordinates of politics could be realigned. But on the topic, on topic of the media question, right?
The media is more interesting for me.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah. I know, and this is again coming through some differences, because I came out of having been a journalist and was so disillusioned that I'm like, no, everything is politics now. But I do believe that. I mean, I genuinely do believe that there's no media that exists outside of politics, right? So all of this structures, even the economic question, if you have a society that has vastly disproportionate wealth with a huge concentration of a small number of people, you will have that reflected in the media, and you will have it reflected in what the media says. But there is the fact that you need to be able to develop an audience big enough to sustain yourself as an alternative. You have to use the tools that are available. In this day and age, Novara, the tools you're using are more effective at developing an audience, unquestionably, than the ones that we are. What we're aiming at in terms of like the print publication is a bet, right? That if you're selling a print publication, you can, over time, develop a very reliable revenue stream through your subscription base that will allow you to not go up and down so much on the tides. And instead of asking, say, through crowdfunding or whatever, you're actually giving people the product in exchange.
Well, I think that's your big advantage, right?
Yes.
Compared to us.
Yes.
That's why Jacobin's been so successful.
But then there comes problems with it too. Obviously, part of the gambit, having just gone off about, the kind of style over substance stuff, I'm now going to admit, the part of our gambit in terms of how Tribune is designed, right, and how it looks, is this idea that if people are going to buy something in this day and age, they're going to want it to be something they can't get for free online. So they're going to want something that you can have at home that looks really good. And I've told this anecdote a few times, so apologies to anyone listening in who's heard me say it, but that kind of line that Martin Luther King wrote about when he was going out one day to a civil rights rally, and his mother pulled him back by the collar and said, if you're going to say something radical, wear a suit. And this idea, right, that it does matter, aesthetics in politics does matter. And the other thing is, we believe that people, if they have the convictions of their politics, will pay for something, right? So will contribute to that if they believe enough in the political line. That's our argument. But we will always be more limited, less fleet-footed than an organization that can respond fast through things like video and digital.
We're going to go to questions in a second, because I want to hear what you think, how you consume the media, how the left could be doing this better. But last question. Do you think the left could ever have a daily newspaper in this country?
Yes.
A daily newspaper?
Yes, they could.
So let's say because the Daily Mirror is on its last legs. It's kind of its business model is premised upon integrating lots of local media. That might last a long time, but fundamentally it's got problems.
Big ones, yeah.
Yeah, it's not really profitable. So you think it's plausible that you could have a successful daily paper like the Daily Mirror, which is politically good, but also can make ends meet?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Daily Mirror is in a tough spot because it's, you know, if you look at what's happening in this election, you can see somewhat where the problems are coming for the Mirror. And again, it's the politics of it, which is that it's a daily tabloid paper aiming at an older market, which is going very quickly to the Tories, basically, you know, older people, again, for material reasons, that they're more secure sectors of society are going over towards the Tories. And so it's competing in a market where its potential readership space is declining. So I think that it's stuck in a tough place. And there's some really good people in the Mirror who are trying to do the right thing. And I think, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for that battle. It's a tough one. But do I think that we could get a daily paper in this country that, unlike, say, the Mirror's kind of editorial line, was actually socialist? Yeah, I do. I do think so. You could certainly get a big media outlet, whether or not it would produce daily papers or whether it would have a weekend paper and daily coverage like of the standard and frequency of major newspapers. Yes, but in terms of audience, there really is no reason why. Because if you talk about, say, for instance, a tabloid paper, if you wanted to look at kind of some of what the tabloid sector tends to do, where you are taking on individual problems in society and you're naming the enemy and you're kind of developing an understanding of where, you know, who's responsible for the injustices. That is a big part of what tabloid campaigning does. Of course, the tabloids are the right, name all of us as the enemies, and Jeremy Corbyn is responsible for, I don't know, making the Queen cry or whatever the latest thing is. But you could do that from the left. Of course you could, in a country with massive concentrations of wealth, huge amounts of poverty, and a lot of popular anger. The difficulty is, again, coming back to my old, vulgar, materialist position, it costs a hell of a lot of money to put together a big, large-scale media operation. And unless you have a patron of some kind at the beginning who can inject large amounts of money in without immediate return, it's a very hard thing to do. You look at organizations like The Intercept, who I think have been great. They produced a big left-leaning media institution.
Great outlet, yeah.
Yeah, but they're backed by somebody who
Media, eBay guy. I mean, he's given them a lot, like hundreds of millions or tens of millions.
I don't know the exact number.
Big
huge,
numbers.
Huge. This is what I mean. So the problem in this country, and it you know, it is going to come down to it. I've tried to make the case many times to comrades of mine in the unions and stuff about these things. And I know the unions are all concerned too about making sure they don't leave themselves too exposed in the case of long strikes and whatever with their money. But the truth is, I can't see any other source of funding for that big media outlet other than, like, at least for the seed capital, for the things that started, other than significant support from the labour movement. And there was actually an attempt in the 80s. People can go and look up, I can't remember what the name of it is. It was like something World, I think it was. I'll tweet about it later. The trade unions tried to launch a publication in the 80s, and a lot of people who I've spoken to in the unions are still burned about that because big money was put into it. Yeah. And it didn't go anywhere. They brought in all kinds of people. Pilger was writing for it, and Michael Foote was like a daily columnist, all this kind of stuff, right? But because it was incoherent, partly because they didn't know what they wanted to say. So on one page you'd have kind of strident left-wing stuff, and the next page it'd be very middle of the road, and the next page it'd be like celebrity gossip. They didn't know what they wanted. They weren't sure what the project was. It's a bit like a lot of things, unfortunately, that can be made by the union movement, which is like, you know, the camel, a horse by committee. That can happen very, very often in the trade unions because it is a stakeholder negotiation process. And that is the risk, and I understand that burned a lot of unions. But I can't see for us. I can see it happening. You could have a left-wing daily. I think that's where you would need to get the money.
See, I don't think a daily would work. From that same article, the Guardian article, I think there's a brief image on, or maybe not, maybe it's the Pew one. people are getting news from their phones.
Yeah, well, so even if we say daily is like
even
now,
older people are more likely to be getting news from their phones than from their television. And
even if we say daily now includes, say, like regular coverage every hour online, right? And then maybe a printing at the weekend. The question fundamentally is there an audience big enough that would sustain a properly socialist newspaper of size? There is.
Absolutely.
No question. Absolutely no question.
That's kind of why I'm surprised.
But there isn't the money. This is where
I'm kind of surprised that somebody hasn't said, look, let's give this a try. Let's see if there's a market there. And then, because it could at least make ends meet. I mean, I don't think it's something you'd have to sink money into, and there's lots of causes on the left people sink money into, and they don't really... Look at Extinction Rebellion. I mean, we can talk about its success or not. I mean, I think it's been very good at putting climate change on the agenda, although its stunt today I thought was utterly ridiculous. But, that money's never going to come back. Whereas... Anyway.
No, I agree with you. And this question of like, are people wanting returns? That the fundamental business model of media today is to get an audience and then sell it to your advertisers, right? Now, could that be done from the left? Yeah, to a certain degree, but again, it would want to be leaning, as you were saying, into like the young audience. Because I don't think you're going to be going out there to a load of advertisers and say, oh, we've got this massive audience of lefty people. What do you want to sell to them? Because they're not going to have any models built up through marketing of like what lefty people want, because it's not considered to be an audience. If you were to say we've got a whole load of young people who are left leaning and whatever, you could see how that could work. That advertisers would want to buy advertising with that publication.
Let's go to questions. Hugh Sluskant, sounds like a Dutch name, I hope I'm not wrong. Friends and family love the short content from Momentum and Novara on economy housing. That's good. We want to see more of that in the comments. What do you think has been the most influential stuff for you? That's what we want to know. A question from Joshua Pym. How might we account for the seeming decline on concentration, getting news via bite-sized clips, headlines? I think social media firms are making an assault on our ability to focus. Is that a problem in particular for the left, in so much as we try to build a political movement on reason, self-interest?
It is, and it's one of the reasons why I'm a curmudgeon, because I think that it creates a real problem. That if we do have a kind of narrowing of the attention span, left-wing arguments, which are necessarily about people getting their heads up and thinking in a more sustained way about society, right? And that kind of trendy academic term being counter-hegemonic or whatever. You have to be able to in order to counter the daily kind of right-wing drumbeat that people get through their jobs, through the media. We have to be able to counter that in a sustained way in order to build our case. And it gets harder and harder the fewer words you're able to use. So I do think we have to fight back to some degree against this kind of shortening of the attention span. How much we can do it, I don't know. Well, we're trying at Tribune anyway.
Next question. This is from Pie Man. Presume it's not your real name, Mr. Man. Why is American new left media landscape so much more developed than the UK left media? Which, I mean, it is. You've got not just Jacobin, like the newer ones, and The Intercept, but you've also got older ones, the New Republic, the Atlantic, which don't really have an equivalent over here.
Well, I would say like the likes of the Atlantic are much more middle of the road, and so is the New Republic too. I mean, I think if I was to go in terms of thinking really left media in America, I'd go from the likes of Baffler, In These Times, Current Affairs magazine, and there are new shows, the Majority Report and all those kind of ones, right? Yes, there are more of them. Here's one thing that I learned very quickly, right? Jumping from being in the Jacobin stable to being in Tribune. The American pond is a lot bigger. It's a lot bigger, and it's easy to underestimate the degree to which there's so many more people available to tune into it because of the size of the country, and because across the world, because of American hegemony of the entire globe, which again is a long-term structural thing, people are tuned in. People want to read about American politics. You get people in countries, every corner of the globe, who their whole political life is formed around liking or disliking some American politician. It's a peculiar world, but that I think is a big part of it.
But do you think, because the US population is 4 times bigger than the UK's? right? UK is about 65, 68 million. US is about, 310 million these days or whatever. Do you think that, because it strikes me at that point there, I mean, it's not just on the left. Like I say, you've got the Atlantic, is it New Republic or The Republic?
New Republic, yeah.
Yeah, New Republic. You've got even like Harper's Bazaar, all these publications, which are basically where the New Statesman is.
And the Nation, I would say the Nation is the most comparable. It's a little to the left of the New Statesman, but it's the most comparable.
Yeah, but even then it seems that sort of, that media space compared to here is a lot bigger than 4 Times. You know, they have like 7, 8, 9 publications, whereas we have like basically just the New Statesman, maybe Prospect, you know.
Yeah, then again though, right, this is the thing. The Guardian, if you look at the Guardian's online readership, the Guardian has about 100 million in terms of visits.
It's huge, bigger than the NYT, I believe.
Over here in Britain, and has 300 million internationally.
Yeah.
The majority of those, the international ones, are coming from America. So actually, you've created, you know, there is this kind of question where if you're asking what the most influential, you know, broadly considered left media outlet in the world is, it would probably be the Guardian. So I think it's a complicated question. Another thing I can say, right, about the new left media in America versus here, is that there's a lot more permeation of socialist arguments into the mainstream over there than there is here, partly because America had the left off the pitch for so long that its liberals are not as prepared to wage war against the left when it raises its head. And so Jacobin has been able to get all kinds of very favourable kind of write-ups and people, you know, engaging with what they write and going back and forward.
I mean, Bhaskar always on television in the US. Bhaskar, the founder of Jacobin.
Yeah, he's doing. Yeah,
he's always. But and I'm thinking the exact same people earning that kind of money in Britain would despise you. Why do you think that is?
It's this reason. It's that here, like the 70s, the 80s, the war on the left. You know, these people remember it. The liberals in this country. They remember the battles and miners' strike and where everything happened there. They remember the battles against the Benites, and they remember driving the left out of political life, and so they're much more prepared to put up a big wall between the centre left and the rest of the left. And the Americans have benefited for sure. My colleagues over there have benefited for sure from the willingness of major centre-left publications to engage with them, to give them platforms, whatever, in a way that over here they're just relentlessly hostile.
I mean, feverishly hostile, irrationally hostile. They hate you, not you. You know, they probably hate me more than you, but the plural.
They don't know who the hell I am, so.
Well, they probably, you know, there's probably a. Yeah.
As soon as they figure out my politics side, they hate me. Yeah.
They're a lot more vicious over here, it seems. A lot more personal, a lot more vicious towards the left than what you see in the US.
There's actually a very good story about hatred. I'll go into it very briefly. I know we have more questions.
Go on.
But Ed Miliband was over in the States, in the Nation, I believe, interning in the 90s, and it was Alexander Cockburn, who I mentioned earlier, the journalist, and he was interning with him, and Cockburn wrote about this at one point. And he was talking about, you know, is this guy going to have a future in journalism and whatever? And he was getting frustrated by what Miliband was writing. And he turned to him and at one stage and he says, you know, the number one thing that you got to ask yourself this question: is your hatred pure? You know, do you really hate the people you're going after? And Miliband said, you know, I don't really hate anyone. And Cockburn said, well, that's at the moment. And I knew he wasn't going to be like, and actually. There's a truth to it, which is it doesn't bother me greatly if you're a socialist and you're getting hated by people who fundamentally our politics is about trying to replace on the political map.
No, it doesn't bother me either, but it does seem of a wholly different scale here compared to the US. Darren Alevi asks on Super Chat, he has £5. Thank you, Darren. Can Corbyn create an before I actually carry on, because you've just done that super chat, Darren, we haven't done this shout out today. I gave a shout out for Tribune, but not for Novara Media. If you like what you're watching, head to support.novaramedia.com, make a one-off payment or make a subscription, ongoing payment. We want to generally ask for around an hour's work that you're paid for. So whether you're on £20 or £30 or £40 or £10, if you're on less than £10, probably don't give us money. We'd probably just hold people to that if they're paid the living wage or more. Why not just give us that a month? That's what we propose. Of course, it can be more, it can be less. We can't do what we're doing without your support. We've grown immensely over the last 2 years. Anybody that's been with us since before the 2017 election will know that we're operating at an order of magnitude higher than we were then. We want to keep doing that, whatever happens next Thursday. So if you want to be a part of that, help us get there, change politics in this country and elsewhere, go to support.novaramedia.com. Darren Alavi via the super chat. Can Corbyn create an Our Revolution org like Sanders has created in the US that funds working class people running for elected office?
This is a question. I mean, over here, I have to be honest, over here there is a better production line of working class people into politics than in the US. Which is not to say over here is perfect, and obviously Westminster is dominated by a very small coterie and a small segment of society. But you do have the trade unions training up people coming from the shop floor in many cases, coming from being trade union organisers and going in. I know Unite have been doing it for quite a long time. A lot of the left-leaning MPs elected since certainly 2015 have come through a union production line. And I tell you, my American friends would look at that and say, how can we get that? Because the American union movement is so to the right and so uninterested in the idea of moving working class people into the political arena. But more needs to be done.
That's a no optimism regarding Britain, then, which we've not done so far.
Yeah.
That's good.
I think there's a lot of things here that are better. There's a reason why this project, the Corbyn project, has outlasted, you know, the Syriza thing in Greece, the Podemos thing in Spain, the rise and fall of France Insoumise in France, because its pillars that are holding it up are strong, and particularly the fact that Labour is still connected to the trade union movement, which gives it a foot outside of the kind of politicos and whatever, or off the campus and into workplaces, which is absolutely crucial that we have some ability to communicate these ideas and develop support, not just of people who are very interested in politics, but people who can see how a Corbyn government would improve their daily lives. We need to do a lot more of it. I think Momentum is, you know, kind of the equivalent of Our Revolution now, if I'm being frank. It's and it does quite a lot of Our Revolution things better than Our Revolution. But there's also a problem with that, which is that Momentum has become a very effective kind of campaigning body.
I mean, it's world class.
Yes,
at what it does.
But it two potential limitations. I think they're trying themselves to adjust. You know, one is that its communication became quite captured in kind of younger, metropolitan, cosmopolitan kind of language and messages, which I understand why you lean into it, because this is where your base is, but fundamentally for a socialist project it has big weaknesses. They've tried to shift that. I think they had Cameron Mitchell from Boss over there on the other day. I was watching a video, which was an excellent one. I think they need to do a lot more of that. And the other one is, in becoming an effective campaigning organisation, you know, basically what we don't have then is the kind of the grassroots political education stuff, as much of the linking up with the campaigns and so forth. And that's kind of been the price that was paid for Momentum becoming so effective at doing campaigning work. But it's very hard to put everything on one organisation. You know, I know people will be critical of Momentum, but like all of this project, it's an uphill battle. The left coming back on the pitch after being probably off the pitch for the longest time it had been in more than 100 years, and trying to elect the first socialist prime minister and to effect major systemic change in a party led by a load of anti-capitalists. This was a tough bat, and the fact, you know, we're still in the fight. As I said earlier online, a third of all Labour supporters in the last election made their decision on who they're voting for in the last week. So there is a serious chance that if people go out and canvass in marginals and knock on doors and win people around, that they can do some of the work of basically undoing the bias written into our whole political life by the power of the billionaire media, and can win people over to the reality that a Labour programme would massively and transformatively improve their lives.
Question from Jane Pickering, the last question. Jane asks, hello Jane, what about podcasts? Where do they fit in? Are they the new radio? Does the fact that people can choose when they listen to them make a difference? Do you do a podcast at Tribune?
We do. I mean, Alex Doherty's Politics Theory.
Yes. Yeah.
We have aspirations to expand as well, but Alex does a great podcast called Politics Theory Other, which came into the Tribune stable when we relaunched, and that's on Tribune Radio. If people want to go listen to that, I'd very much encourage them to do so. I think we should do a lot more podcasts, but again, what we're trying to do right now at this moment is you put in place the parts of, we can see the structure around us basically, and we're trying to put in place the foundations, and then you're putting in place each part, each room of the house as you're building it, and you want to make sure it's done right. So we want to make sure that we have very good daily content. At the moment, we're hitting 3, 4, 5 articles a day on Tribune, so that people can, during the election campaign, can go to us and know you're getting socialist media. And this is the key question at the end of all of this, right? How do we move on from the situation like the New Statesman editorial and being beholden to all this? Well, we are going to be reliant on hostile media outlets until we build our own ones and make them sustainable, and people contribute to them, and we build up enough of war chest to develop and grow your coverage, and we then over time will liberate ourselves from having to be cap in hand to a whole load of people who, at the end of the day, when the question comes, do they want to take on the rich, do they want to be in the fight, or do they want to be on the fence? We know the answer.
I think that's a great place to end on. What I would say, and this is optimistic, is that if they'd written that editorial 5 years ago, it would have been, oh, well, we have Twitter. Well, we need to do something. What has, I think, decisively changed in the last 4 years, albeit I think too slowly, is that now there are very much living embodiments of an alternative, whether it's Novara, whether it's Tribune, a range of other, efforts. So we're getting there, but of course, a lot more work to be done. Ronan, you've been great. Thank you all for tuning in. I would love to have gone longer, but we've done an hour and 15. This has been excellent. I think we're going to be back tomorrow. I think Michael is here with Ash. Is that right, Fox? And then we'll be doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and of course, Election Sesh, our live election coverage on Thursday evening. Don't miss that. So hit that subscribe button. You can also actually see the link for that. It's already on the Novara Media YouTube page. Maybe we'll share that in the comments. In any case, we'll see you same time, same place tomorrow night. Good night.